This is a tour of a few VLT conserved natural areas. And when I say natural area, I mean that's sort of a broad tent, meaning any place that is a natural system. And it's not our specialty to protect natural areas, but often within the context of our working forest and working farmland conservation, we have natural areas that come along and we protect them too. And sometimes we intentionally protect natural areas. So I'm going to just show you. So I just want just a quick look at what we're going to do today and the 4 places we're going to visit. We're going to go from the northern edge of the state at Bluffside Farm. Dan will talk about that. And then southwest a little bit to a place in Cambridge, and then south to the Southern Green Mountains, and then west to the Taconics. This is a map of the biophysical regions of Vermont. So Dan, do you want to kick us off?
Great. Thanks, Liz. So good evening, folks. Our first stop tonight is at Bluffside Farm, a property that VLT owns on the shores of Lake Memphremagog in Newport. As you can see here, the 130 acres that make up this farm are a mixture of fields and forests, but also have some wonderful shoreline and wetlands embedded. On the next slide, we'll find this locator map. And you can see, like Liz said, the farm sits far north, less than 4 miles from the Canadian border. This image is actually taken directly from the VLT recreation map, which can be found on our website. The recreation map highlights properties that VLT has helped to protect that provide great recreational opportunities. So all the properties that we're talking about tonight, maybe with the exception of the Krusch Preserve, because it's so new, can be found on this map. And you can get this information about location, access, and what activities are allowed. So you can navigate to this recreation map directly off the homepage. And if we go on to the next slide, we'll see that we've just zoomed in a little bit closer, and we can actually see the boundaries of the property. And you can really see that there's about a mile of frontage, both along the lake and on Scott Cove. The farm sits on what's called Indian Point, aptly named given the Native American use here. According to local Abenaki leader B. Nelson, Indian Point was an important canoe landing when the Abenaki crossed the lake to travel from Missisquoi, the Missisquoi watershed, to the Clyde and Milhegan watersheds. Memphremagog was really a crossroads at the heart of the Abenaki homeland. Today, the farm remains the largest undeveloped parcel in the city of Newport, and was most recently owned and cared for by the Scott family for 5 generations since they initially purchased the property in 1906. VLT purchased the property in 2015 and had input meetings with the community, and the Newport community identified 3 primary values that they wanted to protect here: farming, recreation, and the natural features of the property. So I'll focus mostly on the natural features and the natural areas tonight, but quickly want to mention a few other things about access and other activities. So on the next slide, we'll find the Bluffside recreation map. So the farm is open to the public for walking access. To get here, you'll navigate to the intersection of Bluff Road and Scott Farm Road in Newport. More detailed directions can be found on our website. And as you start up Scott Farm Road, you'll find a small parking area on your right, which is shown in the photo inset. Folks are welcome to walk along the paths or generally wander and explore. However, we do ask that folks stay out of the actively used hayfields and look for signage about other restricted areas, some of which I'll speak about tonight. Detailed visitor rules can be found on our website and also on the kiosk at the parking area. The most common route that folks use is this purple or magenta line that runs through the center of the map. This can be used to reach the beach, some of the other locations we'll talk about tonight. You'll also notice the work zone symbols on the map, and if you were on the ground today, you'd find these areas are currently closed for walking due to a big construction project that we're really excited about. So on this next slide, we'll see some details of this new bike path that's being developed. I have to give a nod to Tracy Shao, our VP for Conservation, because through her efforts, VLT is in the midst of constructing this bike path and walking trail that'll move portions of the existing Newport bike path off city streets and route it through the farm on its way to the BB Spur Rail Trail, creating a 7-mile non-motorized trail extending from the city all the way to the Canadian border. So on the left, you'll see that connection linking the city past the high school, through the city-owned Prouty Beach onto Bluffside, past the hospital, and then on the BB Spur Trail toward the border. The lower right really shows the detailed path through the farm. And on the north end, you'll see where there's a future parking area planned. And then in the center photo, you'll see what's highlighted is this boardwalk that's going to cross the mouth of Scotts Cove, creating a physical connection between Bluffside and the city-owned Prouty Beach Recreation Area. So the construction is finishing up this year, and we hope and plan to have the trail opened by the fall. On the next slide, we'll also see some of the community uses that are here at the farm. For the past few years, we've partnered with the Vermont Youth Conservation Corps to host garden space for food programs. We've also hosted community garden space in partnership with several other organizations. And this year we have plots for local residents. The hayfields are leased to a local organic dairy farmer. And there's really a high emphasis placed on education on the property. Being so close to the high school, we've been able to form a good connection with teachers and students who want to use the farm as an outdoor classroom. But now on to the natural features. So this map was developed for use with the forest management plan, but we'll use it to orient us, and it gives us a good overview of the farm. We'll come back to this a few times, but on the next slide, because I'm a forester, I'm going to geek out on a few things here with you. These are LiDAR maps, which really show the height of physical features. The left map is showing the height of the ground or the topography. The right map is showing the height of vegetation, essentially the trees. White areas are open, bluish areas are short, yellow is tall. So if you look at these together, things will start to emerge. If you could go back for a second, Liz, you'll see a ridge running down the center of the property that is mostly forested. You'll see the flattest areas that are remain open for agriculture. But I specifically want to call your attention to the steep ground at the southern end of the property along the lake. These are the high bluffs, the namesake for Bluffside Farm, which the name was coined when the Scott family purchased the property in the early 1900s. The forests here are really a mixture of northern hardwoods and conifers. And now you can advance to the next slide, Liz. But what's unique about the woods here in this part of northeastern Vermont is the presence of the red oak and the pine, both red pine and white pine. So some of these have certainly been planted, but all three of these species would be naturally occurring here due to the sandy soils, which result from geologic lakebed deposits and the moderating effect of Lake Memphremagog. So kind of a varying ages of trees here. The property was logged recently before we bought it, along with some older, more mature areas. On the next slide, we can think about sliding over and visiting Scott Cove, which you'll see really makes up the eastern edge of the property. The next photo is a photo of the cove, and you can see these old pilings that kind of run through the center. There was once a bridge that extended across the cove, so essentially a recreation of what we're doing just farther down on the mouth. And on the next picture, we can look up north through the cove and see that it's generally undeveloped and a quiet space. I do want to note that at the north end of the cove, there's a wetland and a wetland restoration project that we'll be working on, and you can advance to the next slide, Liz. If you go to the top of the cove, you'll see the red oval that circles that wetland area. We're in conjunction with the bike path project. We're actually removing fill that has been placed in this wetland to expand it to its historic extent. And I think actually within the last 2 weeks, my colleague Alaire Diamond was up there overseeing that work. So it's underway, and folks that are able to visit the farm in the next few years will be able to see the results there. And we can move on. And as we round the corner, kind of out of Scott Cove toward the lake, we'll find some emergent shrub wetlands, some wetlands dominated by cattails, as we can see here. And then, unfortunately, some places dominated by invasive Phragmites. But we'll be working to control those areas over the next few years. We also have lakeside floodplain forest, which you can go ahead, Liz, the photo here. These wetlands occur in a few places along the southern tier, along the lake. They're located in small basins at the toe slopes, adjacent to those high bluffs, and they flood at high water. So it creates a neat species mix. We have silver maple, white pine, red maple, black ash, some young red oak on the margins, black willow, alder, meadowsweet, witch hazel, cattail, and others. And then this next photo is actually taken looking out from one of these wetlands across the beach. So you can see the physical feature that helps create it. That sand beach is essentially acting as a berm between the lake and the wetland when water levels are lower. So it's a good segue to talk about the beach. On our next slide, you can see that it really dominates that whole southern line of the property where it meets the lake. And you can go ahead, Liz. This is Indian Point Beach, and it's actually documented as a state natural heritage site because of its ecological values. It's a narrow sand beach, averaging 8 to 10 feet, but expanding 15 to 20 at its widest spots. But it extends for over 1,000 feet, which is highly unusual in Vermont, especially outside of Lake Champlain. So that really adds to its statewide significance. The beach is sparsely vegetated except for the narrow fringe along the toe of the slope. We just ask that folks that are visiting enjoy it respectfully and tread lightly to protect these ecological values. And I'm a sucker for wildlife, so I thought we'd close with just a few examples, kind of rapid fire style, of some of the wildlife that we might see on the property. Here's the impact of beavers along the lakeshore. Next, we found some turtles. We have both painted turtles and baby snappers, like you can see in my daughter Elsie's hand there. We found that out there this spring. On the next slide, we also have geese that are both using the lake and the cove, lots of waterfowl. And actually, if you advance, Liz, here's a picture of a wood duck's box that was placed by the local high school class. They did a research project where they researched cavity nesters and then placed boxes in the ideal habitats on the farm. And then going on, these next few, as well as others, I have to thank Liz Thompson for. She took some great photos on her recent visit to the farm. She gets some great shots of butterflies on milkweed in one of the open fields. Here's a monarch. Next, we have an Aphrodite fritillary, and lastly, tiger swallowtail. And then if we go on, we have deer. Lots of deer. In some ways, almost too many, but we love them. They're fun to see. And then lastly, we want to acknowledge that there is a pair of nesting eagles on the property. This photo is actually of the Bluffside nest and the eagle and the two chicks that you can see there, courtesy of Gail Singer, one of our local photographers. And if you advance, Liz, we'll look on this map. We can see that we have a buffer that we maintain with the assistance of the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, assigned buffer around that central portion of the property. And you can go ahead, Liz. These are the signs that you'll see out on the ground. The buffer is in effect from February through August. So we ask that folks please respect this area when they're visiting to have limited impact on the eagles. And I think I'll close here. So maybe like my colleague, Donald Campbell, who I think took this picture at sunrise, you can get out to enjoy Bluffside. But anytime you can get there will be just fine. And so with that, I think I'll hand it over to Bob.
Thanks, Dan. So I'm going to be talking about the Peter A. Krusch Nature Preserve in Cambridge. And it's very exciting because it's a brand new preserve that was created at the end of 2020. And if you go to the next slide, I'll show you exactly where this is. It's in the kind of northwestern part of Cambridge on the border of Fletcher. And the next slide will zoom in a little bit further and show you that it has frontage on North Cambridge Road, and it is brand new. And so they are working on parking and access, and we'll have to be a little patient probably until the fall. And I'll get to that a little bit more about that in a moment. But the property's outlined in yellow, and they are planning a trail through the preserve. And a key aspect of this property is that it abuts this Cambridge Pine State Forest, which is one of the few areas of old forest in Vermont. And this state forest in particular has suffered from some access issues, and it being a little hard to access and hard to know how to get there. So this nature preserve is great in and of itself, and also because it will provide much improved access to the Cambridge Pine State Forest. And so on the next slide, I'll just mention that this land was owned for 60 years by the late Peter Krusch, shown there in the black and white photo with one of his many dragon creations, and his wife, Sally Laughlin, who's shown there in the Cambridge Pines State Forest. And they had this vision for this land to be protected and its natural features be protected and open to the public. And so if you go to the next slide, they work together with the local community and supporters far and near for the town to take ownership of this land and for it to be conserved with a permanent conservation easement. And so the next slide shows the kind of a before and after here. When Peter purchased the land some 60 years ago, the photos on the left show that it was really overgrazed, and this is what they called the sand blow, and it was barely holding vegetation. And you see those two signature pines on the top of that knoll on the left, and you can see them again on the right. And those meadows really came back. And then on this next slide, the forest was also managed very carefully by Peter and has gotten to be more mature. And so on the next slides, I'll just, as Dan did a little bit, I'll do a little rapid fire, just kind of giving you some context of what types of things you'll find on the property walking through. This is near the access on North Cambridge Road. So there's some younger forest that old pastures converting into, and then up at the top of the hill, the next slide is one of the two open meadows that the local community is still working on a management plan, but they've talked about managing all or parts of these for pollinator species and grassland birds. And then into the woods on the next slide, there's, again, the sandy soil that you saw in those before and after pictures, and some really active streams. So that combination has led to some really neat ravines, and now they're lined with hemlocks, as you see here. And the next slide shows one of those active streams down at the bottom of that ravine. And this is an unnamed stream currently, and is being named Dragon Brook in honor of the many creations of Peter Krusch, and also its activities both while sleeping and while very active. This will rage and fill up that whole beautiful waterfall area. And then on the next slide, I just think that this property is a great place to kind of slow down and notice the little things. And I think it's a great place for outdoor education for people of all ages. On the next slide is one of our ecologists, Alaire Diamond, showing us a plant. And on the next slide, zooming in, she's showing us here gold thread and the root that gives it its name, also known as canker root, because the Native Americans and early settlers, I'm told, used this for sores in their mouths. And then on the next slide, what I forgot to say about the gold thread is it grows in kind of moist forest land. So while we have dry, sandy areas, there's also these moister bottom lands. And on the next slide, another denizen of those areas is this Eastern comma butterfly, that its food plants are nettles and elm, and species that also are down in these more moist woods and around this stream. This was right around Dragon Brook. And they're one of our earlier flyers. They overwinter as adults, and so they'll feed on sap running from trees, rotten fruit, and scat. So I guess I shouldn't be too proud that is so happy on my finger for a while there, but it did hang out there. And if you look at the underside of this butterfly, you'll see the punctuation mark there that the Eastern comma gets its name from. And if you forward a couple more, Liz. There's the comma, and then it's close relative, the question mark. You can see its punctuation right on its underwing. If you click one, there we go. And so these are both angle-wing butterflies. And the next slide are a couple more caterpillars we came across in the forest land. This Polyphemus moth caterpillar, one of our larger silk moths, and then on the right, the monarch caterpillar in one of those open areas that is already converting to natural vegetation. And like I said, they'll probably be managing it for pollinator species. And so the next slide is another example of the sandy soil. If you look on the top left of this photo, you'll see the main channel of this stream. And then that grassy area is basically a small little floodplain where when that breaches its banks, it kind of, there's sheet flow over this floodplain. But if you look behind this big hemlock, you'll see another side channel forming just in high water events, and it actually eroded under the roots of this hemlock tree, and so you have a channel forming on this side too, and so you have this neat little land bridge, and it's one of the many features you find on this property that are a combination of the sandy soil and these very active streams that are really neat to check out. So the next slide gets us to the Cambridge Pines, and it's just this kind of spectacular place to be with these really massive pine trees, hemlocks, and just kind of wonderful to be under these standing trees. And also on the next slide, you'll see that there's a lot of them on the forest floor as well, and marking, I'm not calling this area true old growth, but it's been unmanaged for long enough that it's taking on a lot of the characteristics of an old growth forest. And one of those is a lot of down wood on the forest floor. And on the next slide, you'll see there are really trees in all stages of their lifespan. The big standing tree there is actually a standing snag. You can see it's broken off there, and the big down wood on the ground, and then younger trees coming up underneath. So with the next slide, I'll just say that this is a new nature preserve, and this is actually an old photo. If you go to the next, this is the frontage on North Cambridge Road. If you go to the next photo, that's the parking area that they're putting in, which is going to be key to getting people to be able to access this property and to be able to access the Cambridge Pines more easily. On the right, you see some bog bridging or some boardwalk that a couple or many students from the Lamoille Tech Center are helping to build. And this goes through one of those smaller floodplain areas of these streams. And there you can see ostrich fern growing up around this, and they get towering. And so it'll be really neat to walk through there. And then on the bottom left, you see a stream, one of the two stream crossings that they're measuring out for bridges. And that will be the final connector of everything. And then they'll be able to open up the parking and the trail probably in the fall. So with that, on the next slide, I'll just, again, credit Peter and Sally and their vision and generosity in making this happen. And it's going to be such a special place for all of us to visit going forward. So with that, I will pass it off to Peter.
Okay, thanks, Bob. So I'm going to take you on a quick tour of Lowell Lake State Park down in Londonderry, Vermont. The next slide shows the recreation map that Dan talked about. If you click on that More Info tab on the left there in the center, it'll bring you to an external site, which is the Lowell Lake State Park website that the state put together. And if you're planning a trip there, I strongly suggest you click on the link that's circled at the bottom. That goes to a story map that the state put together for Lowell Lake State Park. It's really excellent, provides a lot of history and a lot of information about the future of this place as well. On the next slide, we'll see the history as shown by about a little less than 2-foot diameter hemlock tree that died and had to be taken down because it was a hazard. So this tree was about 140 years old, which means when it was a sapling in 1880, Lowell Lake Resort was just opening up. Charles Hilton was running it. And he ran it his family ran it for about 60 years. And then in 1940, The Whites and the Gardners bought the property, and they ran it as a summer camp for families for about 40 years. In 1979, the state bought the first piece of it, which included the old resort. And then in 96, Vermont Land Trust partnered with the state to help them purchase the rest of the property, and we conserved the northern portion of it. So the next slide will show you a little bit of what the place looked like back at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. Looked like a pretty cool place to go. They even had their own orchestra. It was pretty famous for its fishing. I like the little birch pole that the guy in the back there has, although it doesn't look like they're having a great time fishing. The next slide shows a little bit more contemporary look. Many, if not all, of the camp buildings are still there. But as you can see on the maintenance building, nature is taking over. There's a little nature area of itself, natural area, developing on the roof of the maintenance building there with some red pines and yellow birch, moss, and ferns. On the next slide, we'll see the management plan map. The brown areas are special management, which pretty much means nothing's going to happen there. Those are really sensitive areas, usually around wetlands and that sort of thing. So those are going to be treated very carefully. The green areas are general management, so wildlife and timber management will happen in those areas. And then the yellow is the recreational areas where all the infrastructure is, and those will be kind of intensively managed for those values. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see on the right is the Lowell Lake Trail, which is a 3.5-mile loop. It's really an excellent trail. It's really flat. It goes through lots of different forest types. You can go in Lowell Lake Road to the parking area in the southwest corner of the lake. If you go in the summer on a weekend, the parking lot's going to look like that photo. But I went twice in June on a Friday afternoon and had no trouble finding a place to park. There were very few people there. So if you're there during midweek or off season, you should pretty much have the place to yourself. The road you see on the left there is sort of the northwest quarter of the Lowell Lake Trail and leads out to Little Pond Road, where there's another small parking area where you can probably fit 3 or 4 more cars. So moving on to the next slide, there's this is a tree that signaled to me that this is a really special place. I walked onto this property for the first time 21 years ago and saw this tree and thought, oh my God, what is that? And if any of you know what that is, I'd love you to put it into the chat, and we'll check on that a little later. For reference, my hand spread is about 9 inches, so those are 12 to 16 inches in diameter, and these trees are really pretty spectacular in the springtime. Moving on, one of the other really unique properties of this particular lot is the big pines. Like Bob was talking about, this property is not old growth forest, but it is old forest. Those are pretty big pine trees that I'm walking through. Unfortunately, I didn't have a tripod when I took the third picture, which is in the center there. But that pine is about 50 inches in diameter, so a little over 4 feet in diameter. And one thing that's amazing about this particular stand of trees is because it's an old forest, it has accumulated over the years a tremendous amount of organic material on the forest floor. So walking on it is like walking on the plushest, most luxurious rug you've ever walked on. It's not like walking on your average forest floor. It's really nice. Another thing about these old forests we'll see in the next slide is something that Bob already talked about, which is large coarse woody material or large down material on the ground. This is a nurse log. It's so-called. It's got a lot of material growing on it, including that first year red maple shown in the bottom left, and the arrow is pointing to about a 7 or 8 year old red spruce tree that's growing on top of this tree. The next slide sort of repeats something that Bob was talking about. There's a tremendous amount of variety in these older forests. Everything from seedlings and saplings to small poles and small saw timber and large saw timber. And beyond the trees, there's a tremendous amount of species diversity on the forest floor as well, which we'll see in the next slide. So I just stopped at a random place and took a picture and then spent a couple of minutes, and literally about 2 minutes, identifying different plants in the picture, and came up with about 19 plants. If Liz looked at this, she'd probably find 19 more in another 2 minutes. But if you want to bone up on your plant ID skills, throw your guides in your pockets and head out there. It's a pretty great place for that too. And so some of the showier things that I saw are coming up on the next slide. The two on the left are wintergreen that's flowering right now. You can see the berries from last year on the bottom picture. And the one on the right is a plant called umbulated wintergreen, or Pipsissewa, I think. Pipsissewa, yeah. It's kind of a cool flower. It's got that sort of head of flowers drooping down. They're not quite out yet. Might have to go back in a week or two, see what they look like. And the last thing on this next slide is a spring beauty that was still flowering in a cool hemlock stand. I was kind of surprised to find it still out at this time of year. But it's time to transition to the water and take a little tour of that as well. And this is a little tour of what I did out there a couple of weeks ago, taking Bob's advice of slowing down and looking at things and learning. So this picture I took because I thought it was kind of a cool rock with a bunch of water lilies around it. Didn't come out great, so I decided I'd get closer to see if I could get a better picture. And so when I got there, I found out that's not a rock, that's a log, an old log floating out there. And I saw the feather leaning against it, so I went in to take a picture of that. And when I was done with that, I looked down and there were all these ants all over the water lilies. And I'm probably 120 to 130 feet to the closest shoreline. And I don't know how those ants get out there. I know they can walk and swim on water pretty well. As long as the fish don't get them, they can get out there. But that seems like a long way to go to get out to some water lily pads. I wonder if maybe they're in the log. Maybe some of you have an idea about where they're coming from. If you do, throw that in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll look at that later. So on the next photo, when I got done looking at those, I went over to take a picture of the water lily flowers, which were mostly closed. And as I was taking the one on the left, out of an adjacent water lily came an ant. And as you can see on that ant, there is a lot of pollen. And I had never thought of ants as being pollinators for water lilies, but apparently they are, which is kind of cool. And so on the next slide, we'll see an iris that I saw from that spot. You can see the log in the background there and the sort of upper 2/3 of the photo on the left there. So I went to take pictures of that iris. And as I got closer, you see on the next slide, I saw kind of a funny looking flower behind those irises, and it's shown in the bottom right there. I was kind of excited when I found it because I didn't know these plants were here. And on the next slide, we'll see what that flower is. It's a purple pitcher plant, which are carnivorous plants. It's pretty cool. They have nice wide lips where the flies and things can land. And then there's water in the bottom of the plant, and the insects crawl or fly down in there. And some of them have a hard time coming back up because of the white sort of bristles that are pointing down that are on the inside of the plant. Apparently only about 1% of flies that fly down there actually get caught. But a study that was done up in Canada at a provincial park up there a few years ago showed that in that particular park, 1 in 5 pitcher plants had a young spotted salamander in it. So apparently things lots bigger than flies and gnats get in there as well sometimes. That's quite a meal for a pitcher plant. So I think that's about it. If we go to the next slide, I encourage you, if you go there, to check out the islands. I didn't have time in my presentation to take you around on those, but they're pretty spectacular as well. There are 4 of them. One of them has a loon nest on it, so they've got that cordoned off. We've got lots of signs, so it's easy to see. So please avoid that. And the last one is just a list of the few birds that I saw while I was there a couple of times. It's about 36 species. It's not a spectacular list, but it was fun to see all those woodpeckers work in that old forest and see the northern parula and the big white pines and the least flycatchers out on the island. So with that, I will pass it over to Liz.
Peter, I had my camera off during your talk, but I was just grinning from ear to ear because I just loved it. I loved hearing Bob. I loved hearing Dan, and I'm a botanist, as you mentioned, so I just loved seeing all those plants, and just great. I'm going to talk about the Equinox Preservation Trust, or Mount Equinox in Manchester, which is a fabulous place to visit. I have been visiting there for more than 30 years, and it's one of my favorite places in Vermont. I just love going there. And here again is the recreation map. So when you click on that recreation map on the tab that is for the property that you're interested in, you see the little green thing gets a little bigger, and then you can click on more info again and get to the Equinox Preservation Trust, which is the organization that manages the trails and manages the forest on the part of Mount Equinox that I'm talking about. They have a trail map, a beautiful trail map available to you on their website, and you can pick up a paper copy of this trail as well. So wonderful system of trails that occur on the property, which in the property you can see the boundaries of the property here, but the trails also go to adjacent properties that are also open to the public. Just a little close-up of that map, and I'm going to give you a little tour. You park here on the top of West Union Street and take this Red Gate Trail, either on Flatlanders Pass or the Red Gate Trail, and I'm going to take you up here onto this trail called the Mountain Bluff Trail. So that's something that I recommend. You can also walk around Equinox Pond if you want. And here we are at Equinox Pond at a celebration of the conservation of this land in the 1990s. And there's Darby Bradley, Vermont Land Trust's former president. On this map that he's holding up, you'll see these 3 dots here. And those are important. And also these teal areas. Those are areas that were actually passed off in the conservation to the Nature Conservancy. So the Nature Conservancy manages those teal colored areas, while the Vermont Land Trust holds a conservation easement on the green part. And it is all, the green part is owned by the Equinox Resort and managed by as I said, the Equinox Preservation Trust. It's more than 700 acres. So looking at Mount Equinox, this is actually not the top of Equinox, but sort of off in the distance, you can see the ridgeline of Equinox, and it really commands your attention when you're in the town of Manchester. But go inside the woods and you'll see a lot of interesting things that you can't see from the pond or from the village of Manchester. And so it's wonderful that you can. And at lower elevations, you'll see lots of stone walls. And that at higher elevation, you can get this sort of bird's eye view of the Equinox Resort itself and see lots of other interesting things. And there are also these wonderful streams on the property. Now, those 3 dots on the map that I showed you actually indicated springs, real gushing springs that the Equinox Resort wanted to retain the rights to when they did the conservation work, so that in case they wanted to produce bottled water from Mount Equinox. So beautiful springs coming out of the side of the mountain and creating these streams. Now, the next couple of slides are just going to be to show you that this land actually is managed both for recreation, but also for transition to old forest. So this forest is not going to be managed for timber, well, as many of the surrounding forests are, but this forest is going to be managed to become old forest over time, which you've already heard about and you've seen in the previous couple of places. Deadwood on the ground. Oh, and here's the flowing stream. Tip-up mounds. These are features of an old forest that are beginning to develop on Mount Equinox. Snags, more down wood in just really complicated, messy, it looks sort of messy, but this is nature, managing the forest. And again, downwood with lots of moss and providing habitat, as Peter showed you, for seedlings to grow. So these are some yellow birch growing on that down log. And also habitat for woodpeckers and other things in standing dead trees. Another interesting thing about old forests and about Mount Equinox is that you find land snails there, and there's some indication that land snails might be more common in older forests than in younger forests. They also need a lot of calcium, which is present on Mount Equinox, and you can see some oak, some acorn caps there as well. In the springtime, Mount Equinox is especially beautiful. The forest floor is carpeted with wild leeks and other vegetation. You can see some Canada violet there and some blue cohosh, bloodroot, hepatica, early meadow rue, and a maidenhair fern unfurling. And a couple of rare plants, a couple of rare species, including yellow lady slipper and this very rare purple clematis. So a couple of really interesting things on Mount Equinox. And that's really all I have about Mount Equinox. So I'm just going to wrap up here and just say that if you walk in the Equinox forest, whether you go in the spring or the summer at this time of year, or in the fall, the beginning of fall, late summer, fall, as these people are walking, you're sure to find many, many interesting things. And so I hope you will get there and appreciate it. So that's the end of our quick tour. And I would like to turn it over to Caitlin to talk about some upcoming events and move along to questions and answers.
Great. Thank you, Liz, Peter, Bob, and Dan for a really wonderful tour. Besides Bluffside, I haven't visited any of those places, so they're now on my list. So I'm going to make some sort of excuse to get down there soon. So thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Just a couple of quick announcements before we turn it over to questions. And I see we have a couple questions between the chat and the Q&A. So please feel free to enter your questions now about any of these places or any of the plants or animals that any of these folks talked about tonight. So we will be sending a follow-up email with a recording of tonight's webinar. And in that follow-up email will also be a link to a survey. We really take your feedback and thoughts to heart. So would really love it if you have the time to take that survey. We also would love for you to join us at some of our upcoming events. We'll be doing a tree ID during the evening of July 26th. And then we have a couple of, given our loosening of some of the COVID restrictions and some of a level of return to normalcy, we do have a couple of in-person events coming up that are listed here as well. And just also a thank you for those that have shared a donation. We are a member-based organization and really appreciate your support. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to some questions. So this one is for Dan. Dan, could you talk about what was logged prior to the purchase and let's see. Can you talk about what was logged prior to the purchase of Bluffside and sort of some of those other mature areas that you touched on at Bluffside?
Yeah, sure thing. Great question. So most of the interior pine forest was cut with a shelterwood harvest before we purchased it. So that there's about 60 acres of forest, excuse me, of forest on the property. And I'd say probably 20 to 30 were harvested prior to our purchase, with what resulted in a shelterwood cut and created some great white pine and a little bit of red pine regeneration to start to diversify the age class in some of those even age plantations. But there are some areas of different forest. I wouldn't call them old growth. I wouldn't even call them old forest, like Bob and Peter and Liz described. But they do have some older trees in them. One area is in the sugar bush, and while most of the sugar bush is relatively young, there's a pocket that has some older hemlock and a few old legacy sugar maple that are probably, at least 24, 26 inches, maybe even a little larger, that are really fun to see. So you can explore the sugar bush a little bit, find some of those. And then the lakeshore area was not managed on the last entry. And while I wouldn't necessarily, again, call that old forest, there are some pretty unique specimens of older red oak trees. They're large. They may not be what we would start to consider super old because oak grows so quickly, but nonetheless, they're quite impressive to find. And then another pocket of a hemlock grove up near Scotts Cove. And the trees aren't exceptionally large there, but if anyone's ever been in a dense hemlock forest, excuse me, in a dense hemlock forest, just the nature and closeness of the hemlock makes it feel very mature. So those are all areas that would be fun to visit.
Great. Thanks, Dan. And Liz, Eileen had a question about one of Peter's slides about some of the plants in the photo. So maybe while you're, if you don't mind pulling up the slide and kind of going back. Yes, perfect. Thank you. So Peter, what are we looking at?
Oh, there's so much there. I was afraid somebody was going to ask this. So let's see. There's, I think one is sarsaparilla, two maybe Canada Mayflower. Does that look right to you, Liz? I mean, we could go through this and make a list and send it to folks. They could go back and watch the recording and find them all. Let's see. 3 is sensitive fern. 4, I think, is a tiny little spruce. 5 is some sphagnum moss. 6, 7, and 8 are covering whatever I saw there. I have no idea what those are. 9, I think, is gold thread. 10 is a grass of some sort. So I'm going to have to ask our grass expert, Jennifer Garrett, if she knows what that is. No idea what's under 11 and 12 or 13. 16 is another fern. What do you think? Do you have any idea what that is, Liz?
Probably intermediate wood fern.
Intermediate wood fern. Okay, great. And
Bunchberry on number 15, Peter.
What's that? Oh yeah, the Canada dogwood. I think that's what it's called. It's 15. 17. I can't really tell from here. 18, I think, is another kind of moss, and 19 is a yellow birch.
14 is starflower. Did you say that?
Okay, thank you. Yep.
I think this is a quiz. I think we should make it a quiz.
It is. And actually, Jennifer Grant had typed in and thinks we should do an Advent type countdown calendar for Earth Day with all of these plants. Great idea.
There you go.
That's a great idea. And Peter, you're killing us. What was the trait?
Yeah. Did anyone type in a guess?
No one has. I'll give folks a minute to type in some guesses. So if you remember, Liz will pull up the tree with the bark on it. Can you give us some hints, Peter?
I think the best hint that I can give, I already have, which is it is spectacular in the springtime.
Okay. Marianne.
Sweet gum, nice guess. Not it. So this is actually a serviceberry or shadbush. You normally see them as little tiny shrubs in the middle of a field or the edge of a field. And this is the only place I have ever seen them in tree form. They are huge, and it's just jaw-dropping when you go there in the spring and you see a 55-foot tall tree with a canopy or a crown that's 30 feet wide, and it's entirely in bloom. It's just unreal. And so if you get a chance to go there in late May, make sure you check out the northern part of the park and get off the trail a little bit. These two were between the road and the wetland. There are also a couple on the other side, but they're not too far off the road, so you might actually be able to see them if you keep your eyes open.
Great. Thanks, Peter. So the couple questions about hemlock woolly adelgid. I don't know who wants this. Was a follow-up on the hemlock comment. So Deb, is wondering, do we have issues with woolly adelgid? Cindy, is in South Carolina, wondering if that's a problem up here in Vermont. So I don't know if Dan or Peter wants to handle that one.
Peter, maybe I'll let you talk about specifically where it is, because I know it's primarily in the southern part of the state, but I can say we do not have it identified at Bluffside yet because of our far northern location.
Yeah, it's mostly in the southern part of the state, like Dan said, and until the last year or so, it hasn't been much of a problem, but with the last 2 fairly mild winters, the population of the adelgid has been allowed to really explode. They found that if the temperatures dip to below 0 for a couple of days, even once or twice a winter, it'll knock back the population between 90 and 95%. And that just didn't happen the past couple of years. And so you have this exponential rise in the population, and the hemlocks are suffering as a result. So it's starting to be a little bit of an issue here. The state's trying to do some work to find natural predators and help people figure out how to deal with it. It's a growing problem and something we're going to have to deal with, but hopefully somebody will figure out some sort of a magic bullet before it gets too much further north. Do you want to add anything, Caitlin or Dan?
Well, I guess, there is, when you say magic bullet, Peter, there is some research that UVM is doing on the silverfly and a couple of other. So I guess there's some level of hope there.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. Well, I don't see any more questions. So if folks, if folks have any questions, we could hang on for another couple minutes, or if I don't see any pop up in the chat or Q&A, then we will we'll wrap up. Okay. Oh, hang on. Thanks. Judy says, hi, Judy. Judy says, thanks. Excellent.
Judy. Thanks for coming, Judy.
Yeah. Judy would also know quite a lot about the hemlock woolly adelgid.
That's true.
Yeah. So, well, thank you all again for joining us tonight. It was really a wonderful, wonderful panel, and thank you to everyone out there in Zoom land for tuning in. We appreciate your being involved and your questions. And again, we will be sending you a follow-up email with some links and a survey and the recording for tonight. So anything, Liz, anyone want to add before we depart?
Thank you all for coming. A lot of great places to explore in Vermont.
All right, great. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.